listeners. You're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. I'm your host, Tara Kremen, director of Kobo Writing Life. This week on the podcast, we're chatting to A. Daniels-Annachi, who is a trans-Indian author from the Pacific Northwest. Author of the romantic fantasy A Tide of Treason and young adult series The Violence, he finds fantasy in the stories, folktales, and myths he grew up reading. He regularly attends fantasy cosplay events and finds joy in playing D&D and spending time with his cats. We had a really great conversation where we talked all about world building, how to build a really authentic fantasy space, and one that uses our real world issues like colonialism and classism, and also while being reflective of the need for diversity in storytelling. So it was a really all-encompassing conversation, and I hope that you enjoy. I'm really excited this week to have A.B. Daniels-Annachi, Ari, here joining us. Thank you so much for joining us on the Kobo Writing Life podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your writing career? I'd love to learn what inspired you to become an author.
Yeah. So I have kind of a weird writing career, I guess. I mostly write diverse dark fiction. That's actually my tagline. Career-wise, I started like a lot of people during the pandemic, but I've been writing for a really long time, as long as I can remember. I was 8 years old, binding my own notebooks in my bedroom and then writing stories in them. And then, at 11, I was completely ignoring my English assignments and writing fan fiction in notebooks. And then when creepypasta started, I was on there posting short stories that I thought might terrify my parents. So it was all in secret. Writing has been, just a really big part of my life for as long as I can remember. And I didn't actually think that I would be an author until I was in my early 20s. So even though I was writing and I had teachers going, "Oh, you're going to be an author," it wasn't until I moved to Australia and kind of got away from the noise of everything. And I was able to sort of sit down and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And at that point, I had already gone to college for business management and finance. And I sat back and I was like, I just want to be creative. And so that's what happened.
Where in Australia did you move to?
So I always say Australia because it's a little bit easier, but I lived on a little island that is now governed by Australia. Oh. It is called Norfolk. It is about 800 miles east of Australia. It was taken over in 2016 to join the Commonwealth. And that was sort of a big inspiration for A Tide of Treason. Not necessarily the island, because they have their own culture. It's very rich, and they have been kind of struggling with democracy since then. But just being there, and it really felt like home. I met a lot of really great people. I made a lot of great friends, and I was given sort of the peace and the space to write, and it feels sort of blossom into the person that I am today.
Nice. Sometimes you need a change of scenery to give you that kind of push and then also perspective at the same time. So it sounds like you got that.
Yeah, 100%. I think if I hadn't gone there, I never would have written the books that I have done now.
Nice. So I'd love for you to tell us about your latest release, A Tide of Treason. So can you give listeners a little overview about this book?
Yes. So I have an absolutely spoiler-free blurb that I always give. And that is that A Tide of Treason is a political romantasy that is the Poppy War meets the adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, in which a trans pirate and a mermaid team up to kill a tyrant colonizing king. On the way, they find love, uncover tragic family secrets, and work to reunite a torn kingdom. The more fun description that I use is I tend to hand sell a lot of books. I go to a lot of events. And so I kind of go up to people and I'm like, "Hey, you like queer stories? Do you like trans pirates and mermaids and princes that are confused about themselves?" And when people are like, "Yeah, that sounds good," then I'm like, "I have a story for you." And then I kind of pass up the book.
Nice. It sounds like it has everything covered that they could be looking for.
Yeah, it really has been hard to describe because it's super queer. There's mermaids, there's pirates, there's even a dragon, there's magic, there's politics. But under all of it, it really is a romance. So it's kind of if you are looking for it, A Tide of Treason has it.
I was going to say romance is at the core of all great stories.
I'm such a sucker for romance, and I feel like, so my family immigrated from India, and I feel like a lot of our culture is very romantic. Like all of the mythologies that I grew up reading and the stories that my dad told me and just all of that. It's just, there's so much romance and so much love at the core of all of it.
And this is quite an epic book as well. Like, did it take you a long time to write?
It really did, actually. And normally I'm a pretty fast writer. Like, I can write a book in a couple months. The amount of like research and everything that A Tide of Treason took, it really, I want to say it took me about 2 years to write this. And I did shelve it for a few months in there, but there was so much that like between like the world building and making sure that the characters were just right. And also there were some queer identities that I didn't have experience with. Like there's a trans woman in there that I needed to make sure that I spoke to people and, you know, got like sensitivity readers that could, you know, kind of read that and go, okay, yes, this is good, or this needs changed. So there was so much like research and other people that had input into the book that like, I mean, it took that much time to make sure that it was as polished as it was.
And you've mentioned the mermaid in this story, and it uses the Little Mermaid as inspiration. That I think everyone is familiar with that story, if not only for the Disney classic. But I wonder if you could tell us why you decided to use that as inspiration.
Yeah, so that inspiration, funny enough, actually came a little bit later. Initially, I was planning on sort of a Prince and the Pauper story, which you'll see when you start reading it. You know, there's a little sort of identity switch. My mom taught me to read really young, and I was absolutely obsessed with the Great Illustrated Classics series. It was like, you know, these books that kind of pared down the classics to like, you know, a couple hundred pages. They were super digestible for kids, and I couldn't get enough of them. And my favorite was by Hans Christian Andersen. And so I was absolutely obsessed with this man. Come to find out as an adult, he was gay. And I ended up, I don't even remember what exactly brought it up. I think it was like a Tumblr post or something like that in 2021 that said that Hans Christian Andersen had an obsession with Charles Dickens. And I started looking into this, and sure enough, there's like this breadcrumb trail of letters between the two, and it looks like they had sort of this like torrid love affair, or just that Andersen was truly infatuated and Dickens was like, get out of my space. And so that is sort of what led to me then researching the original Little Mermaid and going, oh, this would make a really great retelling, and kind of doing more research into, you know, Hans Christian Andersen's life and why he wrote the original Little Mermaid and how queer that story was. And of course, the Little Mermaid, the animated version from like the 80s, that was one of my favorite movies as a kid. And at the time that I was writing A Tide of Treason, the live action had not been announced yet. And I absolutely love the live action. I love that we got Black Mermaid. I love that we got, you know, more island culture in it. And it felt more evolved than the animation. You know what I mean? And so it felt just really kind of fitting to tie all of these pieces together into the story, the Prince and the Pauper, the Little Mermaid, and then some of my culture. And yeah.
I love that. I didn't know that about Hans Christian Andersen and Charles Dickens. I live for gossip that doesn't involve me in any way. And like 100-year-old gossip, this is the best.
Oh, there is so much tea around them. It is incredible.
Oh, okay. That's going to spend my afternoon just going down a little rabbit hole here, but no, great. So speaking of other kind of in areas of inspiration, you've also written YA fantasy novels that have been inspired by Greek mythology. So I'm curious if there's a myth that inspires you the most. Like, do you have a favorite, anything that you like to delve from?
Yeah. So funny enough, even though I wrote that series, it's the violence as Greek mythology. Well, it's Greek/Roman mythology, but there's a lot of callbacks to, again, Indian mythology. I actually have this book of like Indian myths and folktales that my dad gave me as a kid, and I reread it all the time. There's so many callbacks in my writing, and I think unless you're familiar with, you know, Indian culture, you probably won't see it, but I do reread these myths all the time, and my absolute favorite is called The Jasmine Prince. So the Jasmine Prince essentially boils down to the story about this prince who, when he laughed, the smell of jasmine would fill the air and make everybody else happy. And there's more to the story, but I love the idea of this, like, everybody else was trying to get this prince to laugh because, like, they wanted to, know where this great smell was coming from and, why it happened and figure it out. And I think that there was something so interesting about, like, doing something for him, but also when, like, the reward was then for other people. It's one of my favorite stories. I have reread it over and over and over again. And somehow also every time I reread it, it immediately escapes my brain. I would love to do something with that in the future. And then another one of my favorites, as far as like mythology goes, is actually the goddess Kali, because she gets sort of this bad rap for being like this dark, destructive force, but she's really a mother figure. And she only sort of becomes destructive when, like, her family is threatened.
Nice. I love that. I'm sure there's like so many Irish myths that I read as a child that I haven't revisited, but it's just such a good source of storytelling, right? So it must be nice to dive in. I like that you forget it immediately as well, because that just means that you're very present in reading it, my takeaway.
Yeah, I figure it must be that. There's so many stories in this book. There's like 200 of them or something. And I've read the book back, like front to back and back to front. It must be hundreds of times since I was a kid. And I can still pick it up today and go, ooh, I love this one. This is great. And then immediately forget about it.
Nice. Well, I like to switch gears a little bit and talk about world building because, as we've mentioned, this is sort of like The Tide of Treason is quite a large, sprawling book. So I'm curious about like what your world building process is like, because you've built a world that feels very complex and lived in. So how did you go about that? And do you have any advice for authors looking to make secondary worlds feel real?
I appreciate that. So world building is such a funny thing to me. What I do personally is, kind of going back to like mythology, I really do take a lot from my culture. And I also mix with what I know. And I feel like that's really important for making things feel real, like, not real, but like that you can sort of feel it as you're reading. You know what I mean? So, like I said earlier, I was living on the island when I wrote A Tide of Treason, and that felt really vital for writing this mermaid character. So I spent a lot of time out in the ocean and snorkeling and really like face down in the reef and like touching things and getting a feel for like what it would be like to be underwater. So I try as hard as I can when I'm writing things in these worlds, not to necessarily focus on like the big picture, but to pick something like very niche down that I can focus on and write the feel of, because I feel like it's the details that make something feel more realistic. So in A Tide of Treason, there's a really big focus on food, especially that is food that I ate growing up. It's food that I cook really regularly now. And then on top of that, there's also weather. There's a lot of discussion about like, the mist in the air. And that's because I lived in a subtropic region. And that's also very similar to, what I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. And then also, I would hear stories from my dad about like, torrential rains and everything when he was a kid. And so I really did kind of just do everything I could to kind of live in the space. And so even though I wasn't like actively in the world of Vispa, I was taking details from our real world to kind of like infuse them into the book. And I think I would just advise others to do the same as much as possible. Like, obviously, we don't live in a fantasy realm, but there's enough of the real world that if you just kind of look at it a little bit differently, twist the lens, change your own story 20%, you'll end up with, I think, enough fantasy to build your own new world.
And what about from a practical sense? Like, are you a spreadsheet person? Like, how are you keeping track of like the world that you're building?
I am, unfortunately, probably one of the most chaotic writers. I have tried so hard to be like an outliner, and I know that a lot of people like, okay, one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to, can I
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
I was like, I thought you were going to say this one, and I'd be like, I'm so flattered.
I have listened to a lot of episodes of this podcast.
I'm just kidding.
But it's called Writing About Dragons and shit. And it's B. Dave Walters, Aaron M. Evans, and Trevor Bettis. And like B. Dave Walters talks all the time about like, you have to outline, you have to outline, you have to outline. And I tried so hard to make myself that person, and I just can't. So I have found that like if I outline, if I spreadsheet, if I do anything to try and say like, this is what the world is going to be, and this is what my characters do, I will lose the story. And I will just like, all my creativity will be gone. It'll feel like I have already written it, and that's it. And so I really have to kind of live in the world as I'm writing. And so I just kind of like, I'll write, and like as I'm going around, for A Tide of Treason, I go to the beach and I'm like, oh wow, there's this itty bitty snail living next to this tiny piece of coral. I'm capturing that right now, and I'm taking it to put in the story. And I just do as much as I can to like mentally capture things. If I miss something, then it wasn't meant to go in. That's it. That's fine. I do also keep a notebook, and I handwrite things. Those notes are also chaotic. They look horrible. I don't even think they're legible. I often don't read them back, but if I write it down, then it's fine. I don't outline or I don't spreadsheet anything until after I've completely finished a draft. So it's like, 80 to 100,000 words are down, and then I can read it back through and build into an actual structure.
Wow. That's the great thing about doing this podcast, is learning. Everyone has their own way of doing things, and there is no right way. It's like, it's great to learn like your process. I'm also the same with note taking. Like I have to write it down, even if I don't look at it again. It's the only way that my brain will retain anything. So always like ferociously taking some notes.
Yeah, I heard, I listened to one of the episodes a while back, a few days ago, that said that somebody wrote their first drafts in an Excel sheet, and I like took my headphones off and I was like, what?
I don't know, maybe if we made that joke, but it's like the Kelly Rowland texting on the Excel from Nelly video. I know, it's wild, but I think it kind of, I always just wonder, because I imagine the Charlie Day ferocious, like Pepe Silvio, that murder board where you're putting all the strings together. Mm-hmm. That's what I imagine when I think about a really big epic fantasy book. But it's nice to know that you're just in it and writing it. Like it doesn't need to be surrounding you.
I do have something sort of similar. This is for the book that I'm working on right now, but I do make one of these sort of mood boards for each of my books.
Oh, cool.
Where there's like these sort of just like, I throw up a visual and I try and pull images that are as close as possible, but that is the extent of planning that I can do.
Well, there's some in there.
Yeah.
And I want to chat about the characters in your book, because there's three main characters, Dorian, Veshik, and Zara. So how do you manage balancing like 3 points of view?
Not with an outline or spreadsheets.
You're just letting the characters talk to you?
Yeah, I really do. So there's some aspect, and when I first started writing, I felt like I was insane for saying this, but I really do feel like when I'm writing, my characters are a little bit alive. I have found so far that it is impossible for me to write a single point of view book. And it was like this with the Violence series, and it's been like this for A Tide of Treason and the books that I've written since. But I think the reason is because like my hero, my protagonist, and my main character are always different. And so, like the protagonist is the person that is driving the story forward. The hero is the person that like is the positive kind of outlook in the story. And then your main character is the person that is really like the eyes for the whole world. And I think because I always end up, even at A Tide of Treason, I tried to have just be a dual POV romantasy. And I was like, this is just going to be romance. It'll be more like The Little Mermaid and Prince of the Pauper. We're going to have that little switch. It'll be great. And then I just found that I really needed that extra character to kind of show what was going on behind the scenes. And so what I really did was I just wrote the story as I saw it come to me. And so I always start with what I've heard other people call kernel scenes. And so I write anywhere from like 7 to 20 scenes that are immediately present in my mind. And that's like what I can see right now. And it sort of comes to me in like a movie. And these scenes are like a lot more present right now. I can see them. I can write them out now. And then I'll go back and I'll fill in, more in the beginning, more in the middle. And it doesn't really matter whose point of view is whose. I don't worry about it. Like sometimes I'll go in and I'll actually switch a scene from, I did this with Bashak and Zara, and I switched one scene from her point of view to his point of view because it just made it flow better. But I don't do that until I've actually completely finished the book.
Nice. So you're doing a lot of your, I guess, structure in your revision. Like it must be nice to just have this sort of raw manuscript that you get to polish up. Not to say that it needs polish, but you're like cleaning up your raw manuscript.
Yes. And I mean, to be honest, it does need a lot of polishing. And like, I'm sure that I could, streamline my process and have better writing in the first draft. But honestly, getting that raw writing out, I think is so necessary just for me. I think we're kind of told that like writers just kind of know what to do and you have to have this process, you have to outline, you have to then write the first draft, then you have to write a second draft. And I feel like it sort of comes from like those high school English classes, but I live by the fact that first drafts are meant to suck. And I just get everything out that I can. And oftentimes that's the entire book. And then I'll go back through and I'll read like one point of view, the entire story from their point of view. And then I'll make sure that it makes sense. And then I'll read the next point of view and so on. And if I need to fill in scenes, then I'll do that. I am a bit of an underwriter. And so I might focus more on dialogue in like the first draft, or I might focus more on the world building, but I know it'll all get done in revision. It's more about getting the characters' stories out first.
I really like that. You're like, first drafts are meant to suck. Because I feel like there's a lot of pressure that people put on themselves to like make this wonderful thing in the first time, but it sometimes can maybe hinder or block the creative flow that you would get if you were just letting it sort of gush onto the page.
Yes, this just happened to me last year. After A Tide of Treason came out, I think I had so much pressure on myself because I felt like it was sort of like my magnum opus, right? It's like, I wrote this amazing thing. And I mean, even reading it back now, there's so many things that I would change about the book. It felt amazing for the time. And I think that it was exactly what it needed to be. But at the same time, I mean, writers, we evolve and we grow as we, get more experience. And I put so much pressure on myself because I couldn't remember how bad my first draft was. And so I didn't write for like a solid 9 months after Treason because I just couldn't remember how to write that first draft. And I think that there really is so much pressure that like we as artists put on ourselves.
Yeah, do you have any advice for authors that are maybe struggling, like finding themselves a little bit afraid of the first draft?
Definitely. So, gosh, so much. There's so many things that you could do. And it really is so personal. For me, I always try to change my location first. So each of my books has actually been written in a different cafe around the world. And I have found that changing my own setting makes it easier to write. Kind of like, each book is set in a different place. So why would I bind myself to, say, my house? So, like, change where you are. Try writing while you stand up, or lay down, or, just move your body in a different way. And then also really remember that first drafts are meant to suck. It doesn't have to be perfect. And I know that that's something that people say, and putting it in practice is a little bit hard, but like, I mean, there's so many things that like people put their writing out there all the time for others to read, and it's not polished. And that's something I think that we just need to emulate. I put some incredible crap on creepypasta as a teenager, and it is still out there. It is immortalized on the internet. You're never going to find it, but it's out there. Like, so if you're really feeling like, you have to have something perfect, turn on like a 10-minute timer and just absolutely button mash that keyboard and see what comes out. Try changing the music. I have a playlist of orchestral music that I listen to. My very first book was actually written with the Halo soundtrack. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot that you can do, but those are kind of my go-tos, is to change location, try different music, and then really timers. So like in writing sprints and just kind of see what comes out.
I'm curious about how you mix together the research that goes into your work with this unstructured writing. Because how does that, like, are you writing first, you're researching? Because your books kind of, they touch on themes of like environmentalism, like colonialism, classism. So love to talk a bit more about like why these are important to include, but also just where does the research start and stop? I always not worry, but I wonder about authors getting like, it would be so easy to just like keep researching forever before you're like actually writing them down. But how do you balance that?
That is actually so funny that you bring that up, because I just heard something the other day. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said that like all of the learning that you need is kind of done in the first 10% of research. Well, like I don't agree with that exact number. I do think that a lot of the initial like stuff that you need to know, you do find pretty quickly when researching. So I love research. It's like one of my favorite things. If I could have stayed in college forever, I would have. So the way that my ideas come to me is often in the form of a question. It's a what if blank and blank, right? So like what if The Little Mermaid was mixed with The Prince and the Pauper? For the violence, it was what if Medusa was the hero of her own story? The book I'm working on right now, it's what if a bunch of influencers got locked into some killer games? And so it's kind of always just like, it's always like a question that I'm like, well, what if? And so then I kind of go, okay, well, let's take us back a step. And how would we even get to that question? So like for A Tide of Treason, we go, well, where did The Little Mermaid come from? Where did The Prince and the Pauper come from? And so then cue some research into Mark Twain and some research into Hans Christian Andersen. And that's how you stumble on Hans's, thing with Charles Dickens. I am still so obsessed with them. So I really I think I work backwards with the research, and I take a lot of notes. Honestly, it all just kind of starts with like a Google search. And then I end up renting some books or borrowing some books from the library. I'll, do a lot of reading. I actually I have like a stack of books from college. Sometimes I'll go through those like philosophy and art books, because you never know like where you're going to find the information that you need.
Also, those books tend to like hit you differently as you age. Not to say as you age, but do you know when you reread something, like when I read things that I read when I was in my 20s now, I just see them in such a different way. So it can be so interesting to go back and revisit.
Yes, 100%. It's funny because I remember like, having to do required reading in college and being like, oh, this sucks. I'm never going to use this in my real life. And now I'm like, oh, there it is.
I'm assigning myself 10 books.
It's so ridiculous. I also do a lot of reading like across a ton of genres, because you never know what you're going to find that sparks your interest or that is actually really good for your own book research. I feel like fiction always has a nugget of truth in it. So like I don't have a set process for research. I just kind of like let myself stumble through whatever I feel like finding. Like when I was going through the pirate ship research for A Tide of Treason, it was an incredible amount of reading that I did. And like a lot of it is just matching dates and going, okay, well, like I based this in, like the early 1800s, essentially technology wise, because I needed to make sure that there would be like the iron would have been able to be produced, that the ships made sense, et cetera, et cetera. But of course, it's a fantasy world. So like I ended up choosing, funny enough, Spanish ships because they had like this whole war going on at the time. But so much of that research, like I could have shaved it off. I didn't need to do that. Because at the end of the day, nobody cares. I've had one reader email and be like, hey, your ships are wrong.
I know it's interesting that like the want for accuracy within like this fantasy world as well. But I guess it's it all goes to the depth of the world building that you've created. Like, so you're using real world history in your fantasy novel. It's like very interesting.
Yeah. And I honestly, I think that we as writers tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves. And we really don't need to. I probably could have gone and found like, a map of a galleon and been good. And instead I was like, I've got, a galleon and a sloop and a this and a that. And I had an entire list and I was like, and I'm naming them all. And I've got this, at the end, I'm pretty sure I took out every single ship name in that book anyway, so people didn't get confused.
And to the one person that emailed you about the ships, you're just like, well, thanks for reading my book.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah, I honestly think that research is like it's super important to make sure that you're accurate, but at the same time, we kind of need to take a load off and go, hold on. It's more important to tell the character story. Because really, at the end of the day, who's going to care about the research that you put in? Nobody's asking. Nobody's like, hey, I want your 10,000 years of history. Can you hand it over?
Yeah, you can then like write the research version of the book to go with the signed.
Honestly, oh my gosh, if somebody would pay me to like annotate a version and say, and here is where I went snorkeling and like touched an enemy to see what it actually felt like. Here is where I almost drowned. Like if somebody would ask for that, I would totally do it. 100%.
I mean, maybe they will after this. Like you'll be giving yourself a lot of work to get through.
That would be amazing. But yeah, I honestly, oh my gosh, I don't even remember what the question initially was. I think I just went, I don't like research.
You love research. You don't like it. You love it.
Yeah. No, I really do. Honestly, everything kind of just starts with like a Google search. I know that people say like don't use Wikipedia. It does actually end up being pretty reliable because you can go to the source pages and you can also see when it was edited. So if there's something that you're like, oh, I don't know if this is accurate, if it was edited in like the 90s or the early 2000s, you're probably pretty safe. So I do use that a lot. So there's another project that I'm working on right now. And I recently discovered that you can reach out to people at universities and farms, and they'll tend to be pretty receptive to like having you just kind of traipse through and ask them questions. So like you can get professional opinions and feedback for research pretty easily.
Cool. That's the top tip. So queerness and transness are key parts of this story as well, and part of your character's lived experiences. So I'm just curious if you can tell us a little bit more about like why it's about how and why you included queer and trans representation.
Yes. So I am a trans man. And I have really I've lived a lot of different identities. Once upon a time, I thought that I was bi, and then I thought that I was lesbian, and then I thought that I was non-binary for a little bit. And these are all, just because I'm a trans man now doesn't diminish the fact that I genuinely felt and lived those identities. And so you can kind of see it through the history of my writing. Going back, different books that I've written have those different identities, and it feels very important, I think, that we keep writing them. And as far as diversity aside from queerness, my family immigrated from India. I am Asian American, and more importantly, I'm a first generation American. And that made childhood really, really hard. I got bullied a lot. And it's something that my parents didn't ever expect. We didn't know how to cope with. And I was actually just talking to my mom about it recently, and she was like, well, you never told us. And I was like, I didn't know what it was. It was the 90s and the early 2000s, and people didn't talk about bullying like that. And so I think kind of that combined with the fact that I didn't see any Indian characters or any queer characters in Disney growing up. The rep was pretty slim pickings. So it's really important to me to write it now. And especially because I have a kid now. She's very proud of my books. She tries to go up to everybody and be like, hey, do you want to join my dad's business? And I'm like, that's not quite how that works, but love the spirit. So I feel like it's really important to write what you know and to also provide good representation. And even so, people aren't going to look at me and know who I am or, what I represent or where I come from. But by putting everything that I know into my books, I know that there's going to be somebody that picks it up later and reads it and goes, oh, wow, this is what I needed as a kid. Because it's happened to me. I've picked up books that I've been like, oh my gosh, like, hey, an Indian or a gay kid. And I've gotten really excited about that. And I've gotten emails from readers that have been like, I'm so glad that you wrote this. Like, one thing that was really important to me in A Tide of Treason is there is an asexual and an aromantic couple. And I'm on the aro ace spectrum, and they actually end up splitting up. And that's really hard. But that was representation that was really important to me. And it's ruffled a lot of feathers. Like, a lot of people are mad about it. But I wanted accurate representation for, like, what happens inside myself. I feel very torn up about my own identity. And so I wanted these characters to sort of like come to their own conclusion and get to really heal and like explore themselves. I never read a book like that before. I've never seen that sort of like, relationship dynamic. And so I'm going to keep writing identities that I feel close to. And I'm going to keep writing identities that like my family feels close to and my friends. And, hopefully people hop on board.
I think they will. And I'm sure that there's just more of that's what we learned with anything about like diversity in storytelling, is that there's always someone that's looking for that book, so you should definitely be writing that. And I wonder, as a parent, does your child have a different, like just an access to all different sorts of books? I feel like kids' books now are like so expansive.
Yes. And I absolutely adore it. She has so many books in her room. She's actually more of a fan of graphic novels, but she has also read snippets of my books. She's not much of a novel reader. She's very supportive. So she's read my short stories, and she started reading A Tide of Treason. I've blacked out the parts that are inappropriate. And she gets really excited about like the characters, and I think that her books, like the books that she has access to now, have really kind of helped her figure out her own identity and like who she is as a person and who she wants to be. Like, one of the most, I think, stunning things is getting to watch your own kid kind of grow up and come into themselves. And she has a very strong sense of identity. And I feel very grateful for that, because I, had to wait until my early 20s to really figure myself out. And she's like 9, and she is like, this is who I am. This is what I want to be when I grow up. And I think it is one of the most beautiful things ever. And she can pick up a book and go, this is exactly who I feel like I am inside.
I love that. It's like next generation confidence is like, teach us your ways, please.
Oh, it's amazing. I so wish that I had that as a kid, but
same.
I mean, that's just why I write now, so that the next generation has that, I actually went to, I was at an event that was specifically for queer artists a while back, and there was this parent, their kid with them, and they were like, oh my gosh, these books look so cool. And it was for the violence, which, I always recommend it for like 15 and up, just because there's violence in the series. And the parents were like, oh, I think that we can get into this. And the kid's like 10, and I ended up seeing them a couple months later, and they were like, I loved your books. I want more of them. And at that point, like their identity had changed. They just, they had some really great feedback on the characters. And it was so cool to hear from this kid, like, hey, I saw myself in these, and I love these super strong characters, and they were going to war. And like, I feel like that's something that we don't get to experience a lot. Like, when you're an adult, you're working an adult job, you're kind of stuck in an office, but like being out there with kids that are, I mean, they're going to be the ones changing the world next,
Sure hope so.
You and me both.
Well, you've talked a little bit about the book that you're writing at the moment. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah. So it is, I've been calling it Project Ohm on social media because it was originally, I was calling it One for the Money. It is currently hesitantly titled These Killer Games. I don't know if that title will stick, so don't quote me on that. But it is about a handful of social media influencers that get invited to a hotel for a content making opportunity. And it ends up all being a ploy to unravel and uncover their darkest secrets. And they really have to fight for their lives to escape this situation, and they get pitted against each other, against themselves, to try and get out.
All right, you've got me. I want to read that. That sounds great. When can we expect that to be out?
I have no idea. So it is, I'm almost done writing it, and I'm really excited because it's something that's a little bit different than what I've written before. It's still dark, like my other books, but I'm actually taking it a little bit step further, and it is a psychological thriller in the vein of The Menu and Guillotine by Delilah Dawson. But I'm actually taking it into the query space, and I can't really say much more than that. There's been a little bit of interest in it, so we'll see. I should have updates. I'll be back on social media in January, and I will be posting updates pretty regularly.
Well, where can people find you online to get their hands on these updates?
So my newsletter is always best. I keep my subscribers pretty up to date. I send a newsletter every couple months, and I'm like, hey, here's what's happening, so on and so forth. And also on my website, like when you subscribe to my newsletter, I'll also send out a notification if I post any new writing. There's a secret passage on my website, which is abdaniels-annachi.com. There's just some little short stories that I post every once in a while. There's actually a horror short story on there right now. There's a little dark romance extra that goes along with A Tide of Treason, and some just extra little bits, because sometimes you get bored between writing books and you're like, I feel like writing something else today. But I am primarily active on Instagram, and it's at abdaniels-annachi. I post a lot to my stories, and then I'm also on Threads at the same.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining us. This has been a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in Ari's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. It helps us a lot. And if you're looking to get even more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us on social. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads. This episode was hosted by Tara Kremen with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham, and our theme music is composed by Tearjerker. And thanks to Ari for being such a great guest. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.